Fortification and humanity have been inextricably linked for countless generations, stretching back to the earliest years of recorded antiquity and beyond. For wherever mankind has established permanent settlements, commerce, industry, wealth and prestige, jealousy, rivalry, suspicion, threats and war have followed, necessitating the establishment of fixed fortifications. The Gower Peninsula, a region of vast historic wealth covering many of the ages of humanity, provides numerous examples of early man's natural reaction to external threat. At Rosilly, an area at the very tip of this ancient peninsula, lie the skeletal remains of an Iron Age settlement, the walls of which betray the necessity of fortifications even in a region that would have been remarkably remote, isolated, even impenetrable during this epoch in history. As history unfolded, the technologies of civilization, and hence war, evolved and became ever more deadly, requiring the science of fortification to match the improvements in weaponry and war. Testimony to this is provided by the Roman fort at Lougha, just to the north of the Gower Peninsula. It was the Norman conquest of Gower in the early 12th century that heralded the beginnings of many of the castles we see today on the Gower Peninsula. Gower was one of the many lordships the Normans established in Wales, and like its counterparts elsewhere in the country, was subdivided into individual manors, governed by the chief lord's most important followers. Without exception, these lordships and manors would need defending, and castles were built to cement the conqueror's tentative grip on a resentful, conquered populace. At first, the castles of Swansea and Gower consisted of earth and stone mounds and banks protected by ditches. In Gower, these fortifications would take the form of the ringwork and not the modern bailey castles most popularly associated with Norman English fortifications. These ringworks were the first crude castles built in Gower, and their remains can be seen today at Penrice village, near the 13th century church, and Penmaen Old Castle, which overlooks the glorious Three Cliffs Bay and stands opposite the more modern stone-built Pennard Castle. Regardless of their undoubted merits, these early castles were vulnerable to attack, particularly by a force utilizing fire as a weapon. Indeed, evidence suggests that the gatehouse at Penmaen Old Castle was burnt during such an attack. A more durable stone gatehouse was built in its place. Despite the efforts of the Welsh, the Normans and their English followers clung on to their outposts in Gower and Wales, and by the late 13th century, stone castles began to replace the old wooden fortifications. It was this development that effectively ended any hope the indigenous Welsh had in evicting the Norman English occupiers from their territories. Because of their omnipresence, it is these stone structures, ingenious in their construction, particularly when one considers the climate, both political and geographical, in which many were built, that will be explored in detail as we study the castles of Swansea and Gower. The first castle on our guide to the castles of Swansea and Gower is Swansea Castle. Like many of these structures, it is impossible to pinpoint an exact date when the castle was constructed in its entirety. Castles were often built in various overlapping layers, encompassing developments in the art of siege warfare over a period of centuries, and Swansea was no different in this respect. The origins of the first castle at Swansea can be pinpointed to the early 12th century, when a ringwork fortification was established on and around the site of the current building. At this time, Henry de Beaumont, 1st Earl of Warwick, was Lord of Gower, having been granted the right to conquer the region by Henry I in 1106. The first official recognition of the castle was made in 1116, when Welsh documents mentioned an assault made by Gruffydd ap Rhys that succeeded in destroying the castle's outer works, but which failed to capture the elevated main tower. This, however, was not to be the last occasion that Swansea Castle was besieged during Welsh rebellions of the 12th and 13th centuries. In 1192, Rhys ap Gruffydd, accompanied by his 2 sons and a Welsh army, laid siege to the castle for 10 weeks. The siege almost succeeded in forcing the surrender of the town, as the inhabitants were close to starvation. Fortunately for the English occupants, internal strife and dispute among the various branches of the Welsh army forced the besiegers to lift the siege. The preliminary years of the 13th century saw much dispute between the English king and his vassals over control of the lordship of Gower. Such schisms in the English side were ruthlessly exploited by the Welsh on a number of occasions, and Swansea's castle changed hands several times. It was even claimed by Welsh chroniclers that the castle was completely destroyed in 1217 by Rhys Grieg in retaliation for the English siege of the Welsh stronghold of Caerleon in southeast Wales, though this was probably an exaggerated account. Nonetheless, the town of Swansea was sacked and burnt on at least one occasion, and of course the castle itself was captured, recaptured and damaged on a number of instances. Truly a testimony to the violence that dominated these years in the castle's history. By the late 13th century, the political situation had calmed somewhat in Wales, and it is during this period that the new castle, as seen today, began to take form, reflecting the end of any serious Welsh resistance to English rule. Nevertheless, despite the improvements being made in the castle's design, the then holders, the de Breoses, preferred to dwell at their residence in Oystermouth, so Swansea was used primarily as a centre of administration. Relative peace was to continue into the 14th century, and this period was marked by the further decline of the castle as a militarily significant structure. Indeed, even the gates and towers of the bailey were eventually sold off. Despite this, the castle's most architecturally impressive feature was added during the period 1320 to 1340. This, of course, is the spectacular arcaded parapet atop the outside walls of the south block of the castle. It was thought that this was the work of Henry de Gower, Bishop of St David's from 1327 to 47, as it has features very similar to the Bishop's Palace at Llanffi and St David's. So the question arises, was Swansea Castle also used as an episcopal palace? Well, though a possibility, it could also have been the case that the then Lord de Mowbray simply employed the bishop's masons who were working elsewhere in the town at that time. This would also account for the aesthetic addition. War would return to Swansea in the 15th century when Owain Glyndŵr rebelled against English domination of Wales. His famous campaign included the capture of Swansea Castle by his army, but he himself was not present at the siege. Legend has it that Glyndŵr believed that he would be captured between Carmarthen and Gower, and thus never campaigned in this region. This was to be the last century in which Swansea Castle was ever required to fulfil its original design purposes. There are documents stating that the castle's defences were beefed up during the Civil War of the 1640s, but it is not thought the castle ever saw action during this conflict. Since that time, Swansea Castle has served a number of roles, including as a prison, a glassworks, a town hall, a post office, and as the base of the South Wales Evening Post. After the Evening Post moved to more modern premises, the castle reverted to the form we see today, a consolidated piece of antiquity in a city of rich and sometimes bizarre architectural variation. The next castle we shall study in our reflections upon the castles of Swansea and Gower is Oystermouth Castle. Like Swansea Castle and many of its contemporaries, it is highly probable that Oystermouth Castle began its existence as a wood and earth-based ringwork, the possible remains of which can be seen today near the present stone castle. The castle of Oystermouth, perfectly sited on an imposing ascent with commanding views over the villages of Oystermouth and Mumbles, has been the scene of much bloodshed during the years it has stood here. Most notably, in the early 12th century, when the castle was burned and its defenders slaughtered by Welsh insurgents. This, however, was not to be the last occasion on which Oystermouth Castle was laid siege by Welsh insurgents. Like Swansea Castle and many others in Wales during this period, Oystermouth was to be frequently gripped by the violent convulsions of Welsh rebellion. What we see visibly today at Oystermouth can be traced in its earliest sections to the years when William de Braos III was Lord of Gower. The keep buildings in particular were certainly built during this period. There is, however, some dispute concerning this construction date within archaeological circles. There is a school of thought that believes that the style of masonry in the southern block belies the fact that the castle was first built by the de Londres family around 1100. This southern block, which was originally designed as a rectangular hall, has stonework very similar to the de Londres Ogmore Castle, which was built around this time. Perhaps the most renowned, or notorious, depending on your opinion, visitor to Oystermouth Castle was Edward I. In 1284, this most controversial of English monarchs visited Oystermouth for 2 nights as part of his celebratory progression through Wales to mark the defeat and death of Llywelyn the Last. But Edward's celebrations were to prove somewhat premature, for 3 years later, in 1287, an albeit forlorn Welsh uprising succeeded in capturing the castle and caused extensive damage to the overall structure. Fortunately, repairs were made, and the castle continued in its development. In 1330, it was even extended with the building of the impressive northeastern tower. In fact, much of what remains of the castle today can be traced to those repairs deemed necessary following the damage caused by the uprising of 1287. Indeed, the most aesthetically pleasant building within the castle has to be the tall chapel tower, which has elegant traceried windows that are prominent even today. The section was built in the early 14th century, after the aforementioned capture, when the castle was the favourite residence of the de Mowbray family. On the topic of the chapel block, it is worth mentioning the efforts of George Grant Francis, who was responsible for restoring and reconstructing the chapel block's window tracery. Where Oystermouth is somewhat unusual is in the area around its gatehouse, best identified by the intriguingly absent flanking towers. The plan of this section was quite conventional, at least on paper, as it is very similar to its equivalent at the Royal Castle of Rhuddlan, which makes the absence even more unusual. So what happened to the phantom towers? Were they demolished? Or were they never built? If either is the case, we must ask ourselves why. These are questions that have perplexed numerous historians and are yet to be comprehensively addressed. A possible theory is that by the time the towers were due to be built, the threat from Welsh rebellions had deteriorated to such an extent that Oystermouth's lords did not see the need to outlay further expense on a military post that was now used mainly for residential and administrative purposes. This, however, may not be the case at all, so perhaps time will tell us the reasons why Oystermouth's gatehouse towers are missing. Oystermouth Castle would be in the possession of the chief lords of Gower for many centuries, including those preceding the repairs and updates of the 12 and 1300s. Its evolutionary cycle would see it adopt a number of uses, including a country seat, a courthouse, and a prison. being of no further use militarily. Yet, regardless of the downturn in its fortunes, Oystermouth still retained its fine views over Swansea Bay towards Mumble's Head, particularly from the ramparts. Indeed, its impressive stature, even in its decayed state, was noted by many 17th century contemporaries. These very same views can be enjoyed today, and that is why, even in the 21st century, its situation and rich history afford this castle an omnipresent place in Gower's historic heritage. As we travel further west along the beautiful Gower coast, we eventually arrive at the third castle in our study, Pennard Castle. Of all the castles on the Gower Peninsula, Pennard surely has the most idyllic setting, towering above the meandering Pennard Pill and the magnificent Three Cliffs Bay. Like Swansea, and possibly Oystermouth, Pennard Castle began its life as an earthen ringwork. The site chosen would have been, for obvious reasons, particularly intimidating for any attacking force, as the castle is surrounded by a sheer drop on its north and west sides. Unfortunately, nature would prove to be a very sharp double-edged sword for Pennard. Whereas its geographical position would have seemed near impregnable to its builder, Henry de Beaumont, 1st Earl of Warwick, he or anyone else could not have foretold that within 100 years the castle would be overwhelmed by shifting sands transported by heavy winds. The overwhelming of Pennard Castle by sand blow would pass into Gower legend, and a whole host of myths arose concerning the encroachment of the sands. One such tale relates how a bold and ferocious chief, who was possessor of Pennard Castle, captured the hand of a fellow chieftain's daughter after fighting and winning a battle on behalf of his soon-to-be father-in-law. The victorious suitor took his bride to Pennard Castle, where he held a celebration with his followers to commemorate the nuptials. As often happens, the party, wild in its nature, became a drunken and anarchic affair. Later in the evening, one of the sentinels on the walls reported, he was consumed with fear, it should be said, to the castle's warden that he had heard a bewitching, drifting melody from the valley below. The warden, who also claimed to have heard the song, reported back to the chieftain, who himself investigated the interruption, and also heard the tune. Intoxicated by wine, the chief gathered his followers and led an attack on those below who he felt had usurped his celebrations. The chief and his warriors charged down the hill and fell, so the legend goes, upon a party of fairy elves gathered below. The enraged men thrashed and cut with their swords in every direction, all in vain. Suddenly, a low voice was heard from among the elves, which swore vengeance upon the chief for his assault on these innocents. Within an instant, clouds of sand approached the castle, eventually engulfing the whole and leaving it uninhabitable. This, according to the legend, is the reason why Pennard Castle is covered in sand. An outlandish claim? Well, the tradition holds that the sand came from a sand mountain in Ireland. Locals from that area claimed that this sand mountain had vanished from their midst that very night. Because of its fantastic location, Pennard Castle is still a very intriguing fortification. The only entrance ever to have existed to the site is via the D-shaped gate towers, which suggest that this limestone and sandstone castle was indeed built as the Norman English consolidated their grip on Gower. It is easy to gain an impression of what Pennard must have looked like when it was completed originally, because, fortunately, much of the curtain walls survive. These very walls themselves stand on the foundations of the first ringwork castle, and excavations have uncovered these early ringwork walls. In the 1960s, the castle's hall was uncovered, and this find was to prove very interesting. Initially, this 20-metre building consisted of twin storerooms, a large communal living area, and a private retiring room, which was used by the ruling lord. The tower of the hall, visible today in part, abuts the outside of the curtain wall and was designed as such to save internal space. This tower was constructed on the rock base and was probably used for residential purposes. Unlike Swansea and Oystermouth castles, Pennard was to fall into complete disrepair soon after it was built in its contemporary form. Despite its blighted history, Pennard Castle is well worth visiting. Not only are its history and the legends surrounding its unfortunate past fascinating, but the various views afforded by its elevated base are, in many ways, unparalleled in the beauty they present to the visitor. The next stage in our journey takes us to Gower's largest castle, the irregular hexagon-shaped Penrice Castle, which stands in privately owned grounds. This castle also enjoys a very fine setting, overlooking the impressive 18th century Georgian mansion house of Penrice and the glorious Oxwich Bay. Unlike the other castles we have studied hitherto, Penrice is unique in that the ringwork structure that originally formed the main defence of this manor is some distance from the main stone fortification. This original ringwork, called Mountebank, was built by Henry de Beaumont and was also the most extensive of its kind in Gower, testimony to the importance of the Penrice estate during this period. The beginnings of the second castle, as seen today, can be traced to around 1237, when the then Lord of Gower, Robert de Penrice, began work on a round keep and a thin curtain wall. This location was indeed a fine site for a castle, as the limestone outcrops provide this fortification with a naturally intimidating defence, almost a barrier to attack in itself. Despite its size, it may come as a surprise to learn that the castle contained few internal buildings. This was, conversely, a result of the rocky site which was chosen for the castle. Somewhat unusually, records suggest that the castle was not to be completely enclosed by a curtain wall until after the Welsh rebellions of the 1250s and 1260s. But perhaps this fact in itself is a testimony to the sound judgment that led to the castle being sited where it stands. There is, however, a twist to the story concerning why this site was chosen. According to a local legend, the castle was built here because this was the promontory on which Rhys ap Caradog ap Jestyn was captured and beheaded. Rhys was an indigenous Welsh warrior who was determined to withstand the Norman onslaught of the 11th century. It is said that this location is where, after much of Wales had fallen to the Norman juggernaut, the final battle for Gower took place. The story relates how Rhys and his warriors met the Earl of Warwick and his powerful army on this very ascent, and, despite a heroic and bloody defence, was killed with most of his men by the numerically superior Norman English army. Plausibly, this could be dismissed as yet another romanticist tale. But it must be acknowledged that this ground would indeed make a fine, natural position for a last stand. So perhaps there is a possibility that the old tale is true. Architecturally, Penrice was, like many other castles of this period, built and improved in a number of stages covering a period of decades. The main apartments and towers initially stood along one wall, which faced the only level approach to the castle. Here is to be found the oldest section of the castle, in the form of a small round keep that was 3 stories high. Adjacent to this is the castle's hall. Also of particular note, because of the history that surrounds them, are two small, fragmented towers. It is thought that these towers were purposely destroyed by gunpowder following the Civil War of the 1640s, so that the castle would be rendered impracticable as a defensive post. With the exception of the aforementioned keep and parts of the wall, much of what is seen today was built in the latter half of the 13th century. The gateway, for example, was built during this era and is defined by its flat-faced towers with rounded corners. After the 1200s, little was done to modify the castle as a defensive work. Indeed, the curtain wall exhibits few examples of defensive features, except for a number of small, solid, semicircular bastions. A pigeon house was the only notable addition to the structure, but this was added in the 1530s, when the castle was owned by the Mansell family. Today, this dovecot is still in a relatively good condition. Controversy is no stranger to Penrice Castle. Neither is notoriety. In 1377, Robert de Penrice, not the first it should be said, lost his estates, including Penrice, after he was convicted of murdering a woman at Llanstefan 7 years earlier. The very same Robert de Penrice had previously incurred the wrath of King Edward III in 1362, when his Welsh castles had been reported as being in a ruinous state. The Penrice family did regain their estates in 1391, when Robert's son, Sir John de Penrice, bought back his inheritance, but, devoid of a male heir, Penrice was destined to become the seat of the Mansell family. Sir John's daughter Isabel would marry into what would become Gower's most important patriarchs. The Mansells would reside at Penrice for some time, until, in the 15th century, their principal residence moved to Oxwich. Penrice became a tenant holding held by a branch of that family until the 18th century, when Thomas Mansell Talbot resurrected the family's connection to their Penrice seat. He built the eye-catching Georgian mansion, which stands just below the old castle, and used this new residence in the style of a country cottage to reside in when hunting in the local vicinity. Today, this beautiful Georgian house is still used as a private abode, and the castle, within the boundaries of the estate, is also private property. Nevertheless, a public footpath does allow for viewing of the towers and elements of the curtain wall for those interested in this significant piece of Gower's history. Having just studied the former Mansell stronghold at Penrice, it is perhaps natural that the next castle we visit is Oxwich Castle, which of course succeeded Penrice as the Mansell's principal seat. The building that stands today was built in the 16th century by Sir Rice Mansell, who developed the previous medieval castle at Oxwich, where he was born, into a contemporary fortified manor house. Sir Rice Mansell and his descendants were to play an enormously important role in Gower's history, being, without any dispute, the region's most powerful, influential family. Sir Rice's reputation reached its apex in the 1530s, at which time he enjoyed the considerable favour of King Henry VIII. He had indeed led an illustrious life. He had charge of 2 naval vessels in 1509. He had served as a senior officer in Flanders in 1517, was knighted sometime before 1526, and served again as a senior officer in Ireland in 1535. Sir Rice did have a considerable hand in his rise, however, for, as a result of his marriage to his third wife Cecily, he had been able to covet royal favour, as Cecily was in fact a lady-in-waiting to the Princess Mary. Indeed, his star would rise to such an extent that in 1553 Sir Rice would march at the head of 500 men as part of Queen Mary's coronation ceremony. The coat of arms of this illustrious family can still be seen above the castle's gatehouse. Despite the undoubted prestige of its builder, Oxwich, like all castles of antiquity, was to be no stranger to controversy. Perhaps the most notorious incident to have taken place here was the death of Anne Mansell at the gate of the castle in 1557. The events surrounding the death of Anne can be traced to the dynastic rivalry between Mansells and another of Gower's significant families, the Herberts. Things came to a head in 1557 when a French merchant vessel was wrecked at Oxwich Bay. The Mansells had laid claim to the wreck and removed much of the cargo to the village of Oxwich and the castle. On hearing of this, Sir George Herbert, Vice Admiral of the Crown and a prominent citizen with influence in the area, proceeded with a party of his men to ransack the village and remove the booty to Oxwich Church. Sir Rice Mansell and Sir Edward Mansell were away while these events unfolded, so Sir George, in a combative mood, decided to await their return. When Sir Edward Mansell finally reached Oxwich Castle, the situation began to get out of hand. The stakes were high, and irascible temperaments flared, eventually causing an outbreak of violence. Anne Mansell, an aunt of Sir Edward, attempted to ease the tension before disaster struck. One of Herbert's men had thrown a stone, which unfortunately had struck Anne on the head, which resulted in her death a short time later. Sir Rice Mansell brought an action in the Court of the Star Chamber against Sir George Herbert following this tragedy. The court found in Sir Rice's favour and heavily fined Sir George and confiscated the very cause of the fracas, the cargo from the French cargo ship. The Mansells continued to reside at Oxwich until the 1580s, when they decamped to their new home at Margam Abbey. This land had been granted to Sir Rice by Henry VIII following the dissolution of the monasteries. Like Penrice, Oxwich became a tenant farm, and deprived of the considerable sums of money necessary to maintain such a residence, fell gradually into a state of ruin. This decline will continue for centuries, reaching a head in the 1940s when the castle's very existence was threatened. Fortunately for Gower's heritage, a Lady Apsley stepped in and saved the castle from destruction. Today, run by Cadw, the castle houses an educational centre and has taken its rightful place as another fine attribute to Gower's history. The final stage on our guide takes us to Weobley Castle, which commands the Lough Estuary on the North Gower coast. Weobley Castle, like Pennard and Penrice, is very well sited for its main purpose, the defence of the fief of Weobley. For its northern side, in particular, is protected by the formidable barrier of the marshes of the estuary and the steep rising ground that leads to the castle. The east was never fortified, perhaps recognition of its natural strength, while the west afforded the most practicable approach to the castle. It is believed that work on Weobley began around 1304, when the de la Beers were lords of Gower, and much of what can be seen today can be attributed to two contiguous phases of building commencing at this time. Again, however, there is a school of thought that justifiably questions this initial date. Indeed, this thick-walled square tower exhibits characteristics that would suggest that it was constructed in the mid-1200s, significantly predating what had been assumed to be the principal construction date of Weobley Castle. The first buildings, built in the early 14th century, were the Great Hall and the West Wing, which provided private rooms for the lord of the manor. Technically, it is worth mentioning that Weobley, like Oxwich, is not really a castle, but a fortified manor house. Security and space for a small garrison was provided to a certain extent, but its domestic arrangements, more prominent than the defensive works, would suggest that the castle's principal use would be an abode, albeit defensive and strong. Nevertheless, although David de la Beer, first builder of the castle, did begin construction in an era of peace, he was aware of the need for self-protection features. Evidence of this is provided, for example, by the crenellated wall tops, the watchtower, and the construction of the southwest tower to battlement level. Further investigation would also ascertain that the design of the castle would, before completion of the southwest towers, undergo a radical alteration to incorporate militaristic defensive features. Indeed, the original plan provided no defense of the south and west approaches, and this discrepancy was what probably motivated the castle's designers to rethink the layout. The second phase in Weobley's construction was marked by a more economical approach to building, the defense of the castle having less prominence than previously had been the case. A number of buildings were added in this phase, including the gateway, the octagonal turret, and the chapel, which turned out to be the least expensive way of enclosing the site, while at the same time maximizing the accommodation available. Minor modifications and updates were regularly made throughout the 14th century, but it wasn't until the late 15th century that any significant addition was made. At this time, Rhys ap Thomas, a controversial character who had betrayed the traditional family loyalties and served the House of York during the Wars of the Roses, was owner of the castle. He added the porch block, a comparatively elaborate addition to the castle, to provide a more grandiose entrance to the hall and the private quarters. After Rhys ap Thomas, the house became first in the possession of the Herberts and then the Mansells. It was also called into action as a military outpost. In 1403, Owain Glyndwr's forces attacked Weobley and caused extensive damage to the structure. Fortunately, the damage was repaired and the castle continued in its role. Like Penrice and Oxwich, Weobley would become a tenant farmhouse, and one of the last additions to the castle was this chimney, built by the then occupants in the 16th century. Today, run by Cadw as a tourist attraction, the castle houses an exhibition that tells the story of Weobley and many of the other ancient sites in Gower. The castles of Swansea and Gower, though not quite as extensive as some of their counterparts elsewhere in Wales, have a heritage and historic wealth well beyond the superficial appearance of their ravaged walls. For within the architecture of these commendable attributes to Gower's past lies a history that firmly interweaves the Gower Peninsula as an enormously significant region in the tapestry of Welsh and indeed British history. The castles of Swansea and Gower are yet another invaluable piece of this magnificent peninsula, a region that unequivocally deserves its title as Britain's first area of outstanding natural beauty.